I never expected to be the kind of woman who cheats. If you had asked me a year ago, I would have laughed at the idea. I was a loyal wife, a good woman, the kind who stood by her husband no matter what. But life is a funny way of testing your limits, and I learned mine the day I met Jake. It started with something as simple as a car problem. My husband Dan had always handled things like that, but lately he barely noticed when something needed fixing. He was too busy, too tired, too wrapped up in his own world to care. So when my check engine light came on, I took matters into my own hands and drove to the small repair shop on the edge of town. That's where I saw him. Jake was standing outside, wiping grease off his hands, his t-shirt clinging to his broad chest, sweat glistening on his tanned arms. He looked up when I pulled in, flashing me a slow, confident smile. "Trouble?" he asked, stepping toward my car. I swallowed hard, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. Yeah, the check engine light came on. He leaned down, resting his arms on my open window, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. His eyes were a deep shade of blue, sharp and knowing. "Let's take a look." I watched as he lifted the hood, moving with the kind of ease that only came from experience. His muscles flexed with every movement, and I hated the way my stomach tightened at the sight. This was ridiculous. I was a married woman just here to get my car checked, nothing more. But then he glanced back at me over his shoulder, smirking like he already knew exactly what was going through my head. And that was the moment I realized this was going to be a problem.
By the way, if you're curious about what happened next, subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Thank you.
I sat in my car, pretending to scroll through my phone while Jake worked under the hood, but I wasn't fooling anyone. I could feel the heat creeping up my neck, the way my pulse quickened every time he moved. He was too confident, too comfortable in his own skin, and worst of all, he knew it. A few minutes later, he wiped his hands on a rag and leaned down to my window again, his arms resting against the door. "Looks like it's just a sensor issue. Nothing major, but I can reset it for you." I nodded, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "Thanks, I appreciate it." He tilted his head slightly, studying me. "Your husband usually handle this kind of stuff?" I hesitated. "Yeah, he used to." Jake's smirk deepened, like he had just learned something important. "Well, you're in good hands now." Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. I paid for the service and left as quickly as I could, my fingers gripping the steering wheel too tightly as I drove home. I told myself it was nothing, just a harmless encounter. But that night, as I lay next to Dan in bed, staring at the ceiling while he snored softly beside me, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Jake had looked at me. A week later, my car started acting up again. This time, I didn't even bother telling my husband. I drove straight back to Jake's shop. When I pulled in, he was already waiting, leaning against the garage entrance with his arms crossed, that same knowing smirk on his lips. "Back so soon?" I swallowed hard, stepping out of the car. "Yeah, I think something's still wrong." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he let his gaze drag over me, slow, deliberate. It made my breath hitch in my throat. "Guess I better take another look," he finally said, his voice low. I nodded, my heart hammering as I followed him inside, and deep down, I already knew this wasn't about the car anymore. The air inside the garage was thick with the scent of motor oil and something else, something warm, something masculine. Jake moved with a lazy confidence, his hands brushing against the hood of my car like he had all the time in the world. But his eyes, they were on me, watching, waiting. I leaned against the counter, trying to steady my breath as he lifted the hood again. "You sure this car is the problem?" he asked, his voice dripping with something heavier than amusement. I swallowed, my fingers tightening around the strap of my purse. Yeah, I thought so." He glanced at me over his shoulder, that damn smirk still in place. "Or maybe you just needed another excuse to come back." I felt heat rush to my face. "That's not," but he was already moving, closing the hood with a solid thunk, wiping his hands on a rag as he turned to face me. He leaned against the workbench, arms crossed over his broad chest, his expression unreadable. "Listen, Claire," he said, his voice lower, now more serious. "I've seen this before. A woman comes in looking for something she's not getting at home." His gaze flickered over me, slow and deliberate. "I don't mind being that something." My pulse pounded in my ears. He had just laid it all out, no games, no pretense. He was offering himself to me, and we both knew it. I should have turned around. I should have walked out and never come back. Instead, I took a single step closer. Jake didn't move, but his lips curved into something darker, something dangerous. "That what you want?" he asked, voice rough. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Because the truth was, I didn't know how to say yes without admitting to myself what I was doing, so I didn't say anything at all. I just reached for him. His hands were on me in an instant, rough, greedy, pulling me against him like he had been waiting for this all along. His lips crashed into mine, hot and demanding, and I let him take everything. My fingers curled into his shirt, my body melting into his, and for the first time in years, I felt wanted. It was reckless. It was wrong, and I wasn't going to stop. Jake lifted me onto the workbench like I weighed nothing. His hands firm on my hips, his mouth never leaving mine. The cold metal against my skin was a stark contrast to the heat between us, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was him, his touch, his strength, the way he made me feel like a woman again, not just somebody's wife. My heart pounded in my chest as his hands roamed over me, tracing lines no man but my husband had touched in years. But this felt different. This wasn't routine, wasn't predictable. It was raw, urgent, new, and I craved it more than I should have. "You sure about this?" Jake murmured against my neck, his breath hot against my skin. I didn't hesitate. Yes, that was all he needed. His grip tightened, his lips moving lower, and I let my head fall back, surrendering to the moment, to him. I wasn't thinking about my husband, my marriage, or the consequences. There was only Jake, his hands, his mouth, his body pressing against mine like he couldn't get close enough. And for the first time in years, I didn't care about right or wrong. I just wanted this, wanted him. After I sat on the workbench, my breathing still uneven, my skin still tingling, Jake leaned against the opposite counter, watching me with that same confident smirk, like he knew exactly what had just happened between us and that it wouldn't be the last time. "You gonna tell me that was a one-time thing?" he asked, wiping the sweat from his brow. I opened my mouth to say yes, to pretend this was just a reckless mistake. But I couldn't. The truth was, I didn't want it to be. So instead, I met his gaze and said, "I'll see you soon." His smirk deepened. "Yeah, you will." I slid off the workbench, straightening my clothes, my hands still unsteady as I grabbed my keys. As I stepped toward the door, I hesitated, turning back to him one last time. "You won't tell anyone, will you?" I asked, my voice quieter now. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm not that kind of guy, sweetheart." Relief washed over me, but deep down I knew the truth. Secrets don't stay buried forever. And this was only the beginning. For the next few weeks, I lived a double life. By day, I was the same wife I had always been, making dinner, folding laundry, smiling when Mark told me about his work. But by night, or in the stolen hours when I had an excuse to leave the house, I was something else, someone who belonged to Jake. It started small. A routine check on my car that lasted far longer than it needed to. A quick stop at the garage when I was running errands. But then it became something I couldn't control. I started craving him like an addiction, his rough hands, his knowing smirk, the way he made me feel like the most desirable woman in the world. And Jake, he knew exactly what he was doing. "You ever gonna stop pretending this is just about the car?" he murmured against my skin one afternoon, his hands gripping my waist as I straddled him in the dimly lit garage. I gasped as he pulled me closer, heat flooding through me. "You complaining?" He smirked. "Not at all. We weren't careful, not really." At first, we kept to the garage, windows fogged up, doors locked, our bodies pressed against cold metal. But soon that wasn't enough. He started inviting me inside, into his small, messy house behind the shop, where there were no prying eyes, no risk of getting caught, or so I thought. One evening, as I was slipping out of Jake's house, still breathless, still warm from his touch, I spotted something that made my stomach drop. A car parked across the street. Not just any car, Mark's. I froze in place, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might be sick. My husband was sitting behind the wheel, not moving, not honking, not yelling, just watching. Jake noticed my reaction and followed my gaze. He let out a low curse under his breath. Shit. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think. How long had he been there? Had he seen me? Had he known all along? My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to move, to walk toward my car like nothing was wrong. But the second I touched the door handle, Mark's car pulled away, disappearing down the street. He didn't stop. He didn't confront me, and somehow that was worse, because now I had no idea what was waiting for me when I got home. Drive home felt like the longest of my life. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my pulse a deafening roar in my ears. Mark had seen me. He had to have seen me. There was no other reason for him to be there. But the fact that he hadn't stopped, hadn't stormed out of the car demanding answers, that was what scared me the most. As I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same. The porch light was on, the curtains drawn, everything exactly as I had left it. But inside, I had no idea what was waiting for me. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and stepped inside. Mark was sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of whiskey in front of him. He didn't look up when I walked in, just swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching the way it caught the light. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I opened my mouth to say something, to lie, to explain, to anything, but before I could, he spoke. "How long?" His voice was calm, too calm. I swallowed hard. "Mark, how long?" This time his tone was sharper. I hesitated. The truth wouldn't make this any better, but a lie wouldn't save me either. "A few months," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He let out a slow breath, then took a long sip of his drink. Was it ever gonna stop? I opened my mouth, but I didn't have an answer, because deep down I knew the truth. No, I wasn't planning to stop. Mark let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You know, I always thought if this ever happened, I'd see the signs, that I'd know." He shook his head. "But I didn't have a damn clue until I saw you walking out of his house." The guilt hit me like a freight train, but mixed with it was something worse, relief, because now it was out. The secret I had been living with, the double life I had been juggling, it was over. I sat down across from him, my hands shaking. "Mark, I never wanted to hurt you," he scoffed, finally looking up at me. His eyes were tired, defeated. "Well, you did." Silence, heavy and unbearable. Then, finally, he sighed. "So, what happens now?" The question sat between us like a loaded gun, and for the first time since this started, I realized I had no idea what my answer was. Mark's question echoed in my head, but I didn't have an answer. What happens now? I had spent months sneaking around, lying, telling myself that I'd figure it out eventually. But now, faced with the reality of what I had done, I realized I had never really thought this far ahead. Mark stared at me, waiting. His hands were wrapped around his glass like he was grounding himself, keeping his emotions from spilling over. I could see it in his eyes, the betrayal, the anger, but also something else. Something I wasn't expecting, resignation. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly, like that answer was exactly what he had expected. You love him? I flinched. That was the one question I wasn't ready for. Love, what I had with Jake had been passion, excitement, a way to feel something again after years of feeling invisible. But love, that was something different. I hesitated, my throat tightening. I don't know. Mark exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Jesus, Claire, I never meant for this to happen. The words felt hollow, meaningless. Of course I hadn't meant for it to happen, but that didn't change the fact that it had. Mark leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his jaw. So what do you want? Do you want to fix this? Do you want him? His voice was steady, but I could hear the strain beneath it. And that was when it hit me. He was giving me a choice. He wasn't yelling, wasn't throwing accusations, wasn't demanding I beg for forgiveness. He was simply waiting for me to decide. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening in my lap. I don't want to lie to you anymore, I said slowly. And I don't want to pretend that things between us are the same as they used to be. Mark nodded like he had already known that was coming. So you're leaving? The words sent a chill down my spine. Leaving, the thing I had danced around for so long. The decision I had refused to face. And yet, sitting there looking at the man I had once promised forever to, I realized something. I had already left. Maybe not physically, maybe not in the obvious ways. But the moment I had stepped into Jake's arms, the moment I had chosen him over my marriage, I had made my choice. I just hadn't admitted it to myself until now. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Yes, Mark didn't flinch, didn't react at all, really. Just nodded again, taking another sip of his drink. Figured. Silence stretched between us. Then after a long moment, he exhaled. I'll sleep in the guest room tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak, and just like that it was over. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the empty space where my husband used to sleep beside me, one thought wouldn't leave my mind. Was Jake really what I wanted? Or had I just burned my whole life down for a fantasy? The next morning, the house felt eerily quiet. No morning chatter, no Mark sipping his coffee at the kitchen table, no sound of the TV playing in the background. It was as if overnight my marriage had become a ghost, lingering in the empty spaces between what was and what would come next. I moved through the motions, showering, dressing, making a cup of coffee I barely touched. My mind was somewhere else, on the reality of what I had done, on Jake, on what came next. I picked up my phone, my fingers hovering over his name. He didn't know yet about Mark, about the fact that I had actually followed through with everything I had been dancing around for months. I texted him. Can we talk? It didn't take long for the dots to appear. Come by. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys, walked out of the house that no longer felt like mine, and drove straight to Jake's. When I pulled up to his place behind the garage, he was already outside, leaning against his truck, arms crossed. He gave me that same slow, knowing smirk when he saw me. Took you long enough. I climbed out, shutting the door behind me. Mark knows. His smirk faltered just slightly. Yeah, I nodded. I told him I was leaving. Something shifted in his eyes. He stepped closer, his gaze searching mine. So what now? That was the question, wasn't it? I had spent months craving him, chasing the feeling he gave me, convincing myself that he was what I was missing. And yet, standing there now free, now able to have him without guilt, I felt something I wasn't expecting. Doubt. Jake studied me, his smirk fading completely now. You don't look happy, sweetheart. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. I don't know what comes next. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face, his touch familiar, warm. You already made your choice. You're here, aren't you? I nodded, but the uncertainty didn't go away. Jake wasn't stupid. He saw it, felt it. You think I was just the escape, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. I opened my mouth to protest, but I couldn't, because wasn't that what this was? Hadn't I run to him because he gave me something my marriage did? Passion, excitement, attention, but that wasn't love, that was want, and want wasn't enough. Jake let out a short laugh, stepping back, shaking his head. Damn. You really don't know what you want, do you? I looked down, guilt creeping in. I thought I did. Yeah, he muttered. So did I. Silence, thick, heavy, filled with words neither of us wanted to say. Finally, he sighed. Look, Claire, I like you, I wanted you, but I didn't sign up to be the guy you test drive while you figure out your life. My chest tight. That's not what this was. Wasn't it? His expression was unreadable now. You left him, but not for me. You left him because you weren't happy, and that's different. I exhaled shakily because he was right. I had made my decision, but not because I saw a future with Jake, because I saw no future with Mark. Jake ran a hand through his hair, looking at me one last time before shaking his head. You should go, Claire. I swallowed hard, my heart sinking. Jake, go. His voice was firm, final. I stood there for a moment, waiting for him to change his mind, but he didn't. So I turned, walked back to my car, and drove away. And for the first time in months, I was truly alone, and maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what I needed. The drive home felt different. Not like the rush of adrenaline I used to feel after sneaking around with Jake, not like the guilt that used to claw at me when I returned to Mark. This was something else, emptiness. I had spent so much time tangled between two men, telling myself that one of them held the answer to my happiness. But now one was gone by my choice and the other had sent me away without looking back. And that left me with no one but myself. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked smaller somehow. Or maybe I was just seeing it differently now. I stepped inside, expecting Mark to still be in the guest room, waiting to talk, waiting for something. But the second I walked past the kitchen, I saw it. His keys, his wallet, gone. My stomach dropped. I walked faster, checking the bedroom. His closet was half empty. His suitcase was missing. And then I saw the note on the dresser. I swallowed hard as I picked it up, my hands shaking slightly. Claire, I won't drag this out. You made your choice and now I'm making mine. I'll have a lawyer reach out in a few days to sort everything out. No need to talk this to death. It's done. Mark. The words hit harder than I expected. I had told myself I was ready for this, that I wanted this. But standing here holding proof that my marriage was officially over, I felt a kind of loss I hadn't prepared for. Not because I wanted him back. Not because I regretted leaving, but because it was real now. No turning back. No one waiting for me to change my mind. I was on my own. I sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the letter until my vision blurred. For the first time in a long time, there was no noise, no distractions, just me. And maybe that was the scariest part of all. The silence in the house was suffocating. For years, I had moved through these rooms as someone's wife, someone's caretaker, someone who belonged to something bigger than just me. But now I was just Claire. No husband, no lover, no distraction. I should have felt free. I should have felt relief. Instead, there was only an ache in my chest, a hollow feeling I couldn't quite shake. I wandered through the house, my fingertips dragging along the furniture, the walls, everything that used to make this place ours. The memories were still here, stitched into every corner, but now they felt foreign, like echoes of a life that belonged to someone else. I poured myself a drink, something strong, something that burned on the way down. Maybe I was trying to numb it, or maybe I just wanted to feel something. I thought about calling Jake. The urge was there, a familiar pull, like muscle memory. But as I stared at my phone, I realized something. For months, I had been running, first from my marriage, then into Jake's arms, then back and forth between two lives I didn't really belong to. And now that both of those doors had closed, I was left with the one thing I had been avoiding all along, myself. I set the phone down, no calls, no texts, no running. For once, I needed to sit with the choices I had made, to face them, to figure out what came next without leaning on someone else to tell me. I had spent so much time craving someone to want me, to see me. Now it was time for me to see myself. I took another sip of my drink, staring out the window at the fading evening light. The past was gone. The future was uncertain, and for the first time in years, I had to figure out who the hell I was without a man to define me. Maybe that was terrifying, but maybe, just maybe, it was the only thing that had ever truly been mine.
Thank you for watching the video. If you want to hear more stories, subscribe to the channel and like the video. Videos are released every day. Good luck to everyone.